Hello again.
Hi, Fred.
Headset's on.
You're right, aren't you? Yeah, I'll pause the record and hear from your remarks.
I saw the Google Doc, so I get it. Yeah,
Brilliant.
Everyone's on my Google Doc. We've succeeded at that.
there you go.
Excellent. So, Alistair and Shah, are you? I shall put you in the attendee room. I'm not saying demoted, but it's just in a different space there. So I will I'll do that now, and so you can do all the things you need to do. Let me do that.
Thank you all. Before we head off, just a giant thank you.
Thank you, Shar.
See you on the other side.
And so everybody goes off
you,
mic
Fred.
and off video until we get promoted, or how's it going to work?
What the suggestion was that at the opening that we were actually on camera, because there's a great panel and it looks great, I think, when it comes on and seeing everybody. I will then, as Kaya starts talking, I will spotlight her, and then we'll you know, if you want to turn your cameras off then that would be great. If you turn your mics off, that would be great too. What I'm planning to do is I will just send you a quick reminder before we start to unmute and just be on standby for when your session's on. So that's the plan there. Any issues, just give me a shout via the text, and yeah, looking forward to it. So we've got a minute left. So it'll be a countdown from 10, and I will be 10 this time. So I'm just saying that to James. So he's aware.
Sorry, the noise is on my mic there. Great, so my video's off. Okay, we're recording. Great stuff. Okay, so we get that there. Just waiting for it to click on the 2 and on the 4, I should say. Get the timing right. Brilliant. Looking forward to everybody. Okay, here we go in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3.
Welcome, everyone. Hello, friends. On behalf of our team working on the COP26 high-level champions team in this race to zero, on behalf of our dedicated industry speakers who made the time to be with us today, on behalf of the other young climate and resilience leaders who are setting the agenda, we are delighted you all could join us. My name is Kaya Axelson, and I'll be moderating. I am the Policy Engagement Fellow at the University of Oxford, where we are launching a new research program called Oxford Net Zero. I also serve as a strategic advisor to the Race to Zero campaign, so my work is to help host the most meaningful dialogues in which people can come together and come away with more information and inspiration than they had before to contribute to our shared goal of a net zero world. In the last 5 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement, through ups and downs in international climate politics, with incredible acts of leadership from some countries and outright denial from others, my own, 2 things have remained constant. We have seen increasing ambition from the private sector, with a wave of new net zero commitments from industry leaders like those joining us today. Thank you for being with us. And young people have led the way, driving more ambitious action at every level of society. I can't underestimate to you the commitment of young people to battle the climate crisis today. I once myself spent months living with a community of youth activists who slept on the side of the road, moving from camp to prevent deforestation of old growth forests and to resist new pipelines being built through native lands. In this community, we lived for the cause. We shared food stamps and paid for each other's medical bills, rent, and jail support. Often, it feels like we only lost ground in those efforts and lost nature in the meantime. But sometimes we win big. Speaking of winning big, I think we can all afford to take a moment to celebrate last week's US election, where, yet again, young people played a key role in pulling more climate ambition out of candidates across the political spectrum and making the debate no longer a question of whether we acknowledge climate change, but a question of how many trillions of US dollars constitutes an appropriate response. In addition to this, a fourfold increase in corporate interest in nature-based carbon credit projects, and a more than doubling of net zero commitments since school strikers began taking to the streets is often referred to as the Greta effect. But Greta herself has said that it's a movement much wider than one individual. It is especially our young leaders from the Global South who are showing the world what it means to step up to the crisis by modeling and scaling regenerative practices and business models while dealing with the present and real impacts of climate change. Our lead partner in this event is the Resilient 40 Network, a powerful group of youth climate and social activists that provides a formal platform highlighting the work of young people on climate change across the continent of Africa. Since its start in 2019, the group has expanded to over 60 members, representing 29 African countries. Young people, bracing ourselves for a future under increased impacts of climate change, are committed, informed, and resilient. But we also know that we can't do it alone. We need institutional support, and of all of the institutions that I have ever been a part of, few have offered more opportunities to young global sustainability leaders than Oxford's Said Business School. It is therefore my greatest pleasure to introduce you to our opening speaker and the first person to be brave enough to allow me to host a Youth Setting the Agenda event on his campus over a year ago, a beloved professor, leader, and dean, Peter Tufano. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Kaya. Thank you for that overly kind introduction, and thank you for your leadership. I'd like to frame this event and why I was thrilled, although somewhat scared, to have Kaya host her event at the school, and also why I'm thrilled to be here. A word that I like to use to describe what we are trying to do at Said Business School is a word that is not often used when we, in business schools, and that word is justice. Justice, if you look it up in the dictionary, is about the administration of fairness. The administration of fairness. So we are called, for example, in a stakeholder world, to administer fairness, to allocate resources and across different groups. And if we think about the major issues the world is facing, a pandemic, an economic crisis, racial tensions, and certainly a climate emergency, they bring to the fore issues of divisions between different groups. And if we focus on climate in particular, there's two dimensions of where we're going to have to administer fairness. One dimension of administering fairness will be all about how it is that it's either rich or poor, or, for example, coastal versus inland, but various geographical areas will find the differential impact of climate. We're also finding racial impacts on the differential impact of climate. But I think the most profound distribution of fairness that we're going to have to deal with will be, in fact, the distribution that's intergenerational, because my generation is the one that will pass along a set of problems to a youth generation, and that's not fair. And so this intergenerational question of justice, I think, is extraordinarily important. In places like the UN and other boardrooms, we might have pretty good representation across geographies, but we don't tend to have good representation in this intergenerational way. And so therefore, when the idea of this youth setting the agenda proposal was made to me, it seemed obvious that this is a great deal. This makes a great deal of sense, especially around this climate issue, where else but in this issue do we need to get the voices of the youth? Because ultimately, it's not just the Gretas and the Kayas of the world, but youth across the world that are going to have to address these issues. So I'm thrilled to be part of this. I'm also thrilled to do this in conjunction not only with all of you, but to do this in conjunction with the Smith School of the Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University. Why is that? Clearly the biggest problems of the world will require many hands to fix them, many brains and many hands. And therefore we acknowledge that we can't do anything effectively by ourselves, that we can do even better if we work with others. So working across the boundaries of the Smith School, and Kaya does that, and some of the other people that you'll hear from over the course of the series do that so effectively. And that, to me, is part of the solution. We will never solve the big problems of the world if we try to do them by ourselves, nor if we try to take all the credit for it. And so here I am, just going to join in this conversation and listen to the great speakers who are going to follow me. But I really do want to say how important this agenda is to me personally, to my school, and to the university. And so, and I'd like to turn it over to, back to Kaya. And as I said, Kaya, thank you for those kind introductions, and also for your leadership. You're a tremendous role model for other young people.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. That was really lovely introduction, and we're so grateful for your leadership at the business school. I always tell people that they should apply. So our first speaker of the session is Farai Chireje. Farai is a chemical engineer, and Farai has dedicated his life the last 5 years working on developing sustainable aviation fuel. Farai, would you please feel free to take the stand?
Thank you very much, Kaya. Good evening, everyone. As Kaya mentioned, I am a chemical engineer with key interests in renewable energy systems, technology development, and sustainability. So I come from South Africa, a part of the world where most people don't dare dream of traveling far, and they don't often buy and burn fuel. Yet this same people are bearing the brunt of the climate impacts from the global greenhouse gas emissions, including those from industry. So scientists have warned that South Africa and much of sub-Saharan Africa will warm twice as fast when compared to the global average. And this counts more for a lot of Africans than it does for those in the north. And it puts us at the center of the global climate crisis. So to me, it means that we will need to define what is necessary travel and to scale solutions to decarbonize flying, or else people will begin to ask themselves if they value flying more above people's lives. So I personally work on sustainable aviation fuel because I want to be part of scaling solutions so we don't have to dash people's dreams of traveling, and to allow them to do so without causing harm. Long-haul transport companies like Quinn & Argyll and the airlines involved in the IAG are among those that are beginning to ask themselves these questions. But we need you and the whole industry to be much more actively involved in bringing sustainable fuel with lower climate impact into our transport system, as well as along every single step of the value chain. Now, in order for these projects to take off, investors will usually ask for takeoff agreements. And from the conversations that I've heard with some airlines, they ask you, bring us the fuel and we'll purchase it. But it does not work that way. They need to be part of the process. So I acknowledge the work of Velocis, of Shell and IAG to bring SAF to the UK, but more of these partnerships and greater ambition to scale up and multiply these projects are required in order to save our climate. So I have 3 questions for our speakers today. And my first one is open to all of our panelists. And that is, what is the total investment your companies are making to develop sustainable fuels and transport technology? Related to that, how are you working collaboratively with other industry stakeholders?
Thank you so much, Farai. This question seems like it would be a good one for Eva from Daimler and Otto from Kuehne + Nagel. Would you kick us off with the response to that question?
Ladies first, I would say. Eva, or shall I?
All right. Unfortunately, from an automotive perspective, we looked into e-fuels, but compared to the other option, going to battery electric vehicles, it seems to be the one we would pursue only if the cost situation really changes. So we are right now more pursuing the path of battery electric passenger cars, actually. And for the trucks, hydrogen. So until kind of the cost situation changes, that would be our preference.
Thank you. Eva, could you say more about how you're scaling the electric vehicle work?
Well, for the electric vehicles, we have a clear plan. As Nigel already pointed out, we have our ambition 2039. Until then, we want to be CO2 neutral. And so we are having a clear plan how we go in steps, introducing now all electric battery vehicles and about 20 plug-in hybrid vehicles. And then by 2025, we want to have 25% of our sales in battery electric, and 2030 above 50% xEVs of our sales. So that's the plan we are pursuing, but battery electric is the preferred choice for passenger cars.
Thank you so much. Otto, would you speak next to that question?
If I can answer this, we as Kuehne+Nagel, of course, we are involved in freight transportation worldwide. And if you think that, if you consider that freight transportation, about 3 billion tons of CO2 is emitted by all freight transport, whether it's on trucks, whether it's on shipping, or whether it's through airline transportation. And I talk the pure freight part. And we are involved, as we do not own any assets ourselves, so we don't own any vessels or planes, but we organize transports worldwide. But we are heavily involved with, for instance, shipping lines. There's a Getting to Zero coalition to have the first vessel, non-zero carbon vessel by 2030 on the market. Shipping lines have, certain shipping lines have said by 2050 they want to have all their vessels running carbon neutral with carbon neutral fuels. So we are partnering with them, we are collaborating. So there is good news that things are developing from a technical point of view. The bad news is it will last at least another 10 to 15 years before we see the first big scale vessels running on non-carbon fuel. So that's why we decided, we are, for instance, going on biofuel right now. We are selling this to customers, second grade biofuel, and first customers are accepting this, although it's quite a bit more expensive. So we can offer a carbon neutral supply chain right from the beginning, but there is not enough biofuels available to run globally all fleets. So the industry is working on it. That makes me feel optimistic on it, on ammonia, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, but it's still a long way to go. So we have to do, that's why we, for instance, partnered also with organizations where we said we have to invest into offsetting projects, because till those vessels are there, it will last another 10 to 15 years, as I said.
Okay, no, thanks very much for those responses, Eva and Otto. Eva, I certainly do agree that maybe for ground transport, electrification is the way to go. And Otto, will you be in a position to give an indication of the kind of investment, capital or otherwise, that you are putting to develop into this technology? As you mentioned, it is still some time away, or it takes some time to develop.
No, we ourselves are not investing into this because, as I said, we do not own any vessels or planes. So the airlines are investing into this, of course, or the shipping lines are investing into this, but it will cost money. And that's what we are telling our customers, of course, because we sit between the airline and the shipping line and talk to a lot of customers. We say, this will not come for free. So this will increase transport costs, especially in the beginning, till you build up scale on the new fuels. But we see, and that's a positive thing, when we start to sell this now, and freight transport will increase by perhaps 10, 20% in the beginning. I talk now shipping, ocean transportation, but the first customers are willing to pay for this. And that's the good news. So there will be in the beginning more investment needed, and it has to come from the airlines, from the shipping lines, but in the end, somebody has to pay for this. In the end consumer will pay for this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Otto. I do have another question. This one may be directed to ING, and please feel free to also add to what Otto has responded. So what we are seeing at the moment is that sustainable fuel development is northern-centric. And my question is, what are you doing to develop sustainable fuels in the global south, particularly in Africa? Which has a lot of resources. We talk about sustainable biomass, wind, solar. because you might have a situation where climate conscious travelers might be able to fly from the UK to Cape Town summer, but how would they be able to get back if there are no sustainable fuels being developed here in Africa?
Thank you, Farai. It's a great question, and just to say, it's great to be a part of this panel. And let me just give you a bit of context around sustainable aviation fuels. We in the industry believe they have a significant role to play. Anywhere between 30 and 70% of our fuels could be sustainable aviation fuels by 2050. The way airlines are structured, you have most influence in your hubs, because that is where you have the most demand to be able to buy the fuel to create the volume. You have the knowledge of the local market, and also you have the influence over lobbying on policy. So for IAG, our focus is very much in the UK and in Spain. And so you probably know we have our flagship project with Shell to build, Europe's first waste to jet fuel plant here in the UK. And we have committed $400 million of investment to that plant. And that's a mix of, you've mentioned offtake agreements, they're very important, but actually to make this happen, we've actually got to invest in the plant itself. So we're actually willing to, take an equity stake in that plant. But in terms of how do we make this happen around the world, I mean, the great news is that aviation has got a very strong record of collaboration, historically through safety and security and technical standards, and now through sustainability. So we have a very strong industry association in the name of IATA, who have a big focus on sustainable aviation fuels. So we take all of our experience and knowledge into IATA and we share it with global airlines. And I have to say, South African Airlines, for instance, have been very active in this space. And I know they've had some development projects in this area. But we also collaborate at an intergovernmental level through ICAO. So you're probably aware, ICAO have a big drive on sustainability. One of their big focuses will be sustainable aviation fuels. So we've got the next big target is the General Assembly in 2022, where we're looking to establish a global goal on carbon emissions, and I hope that's net zero emission by 2050. But aligned to that, we'd also hope there'd be a sustainable aviation target, and that will then help all those countries get on board that they have to progress their own projects. But I mean, South Africa itself, so as I said, South African Airways, they have great track record in this area, and I know they've got development projects. But you also have in the shape of Sasol, they have fantastic experience with production of synthetic fuels. So they've been producing Fischer-Tropsch-based synthetic fuels, not necessarily sustainable fuels because it's coal to liquid, but they know the technology, which is the technology we're using in our biofuels plants. So I think there's a great ground and foundation for South Africa to become one of the leading countries in the production of sustainable aviation fuels.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Jonathan. It is good to hear industry leaders seeing that leg, and if any leg that you can pull to help us here in South Africa develop sustainable aviation fuels, I think that would be truly awesome. I think maybe my last question to Shell and BP, just taking or moving on this theme of developing the sustainable aviation fuels. So one of the quickest and cheapest ways to produce sustainable aviation fuels is using brownfield infrastructure. And currently, the only commercial SAF facility in the US was converted from a fossil refinery. So can we expect to see similar investments in Africa from Shell and BP? Perhaps, if I'm to be specific, the Sapref refinery, which is co-owned by Shell and BP here in South Africa.
So yes, thank you very much, Farai. If I might go first. Yes, I think I would agree with the comments of the previous speakers. Aviation in particular is a global industry. So when you're taking an approach to bringing a new fuel in, it has to be something where you have to think about how do you change the entire market, or you run into some competitiveness issues. And so I think from our perspective, it has to be a solution that we think about globally. In terms of your point about being northern centric, I think we feel that you need to start somewhere. And right now, sustainable aviation fuels are not cost competitive, in fact, quite a ways from. And so you need to have a policy environment that's able to support moving and making this fuel more commercial and deploying it. And in Europe, for example, we are part of the Clean Skies for Tomorrow initiative. which includes airlines, airports, fuel suppliers like us. And the idea there is, again, what we've done is sort of asked or put forward our ask to the European Commission saying, can we have a mandate for blending in sustainable aviation fuels starting from 2025 and then ramping it up. So you need that kind of mechanism coming in to help create the market, both for the offtake, but also to commercialize these fuels. Also, you need to think about, if you have these sort of mandates, then the infrastructure that's needed to refuel, et cetera, at airports will also develop. So you need to have all these pieces of the puzzle moving together. Now, I think, for us, we do think that you have to build up capacity in terms of what kind of sustainable aviation fuel. So there are things you can do today which are cheaper, but with an eye towards the future, where you're looking for genuinely more using advanced biofuels, syn fuels, et cetera, to meet that demand. As a previous speaker said, we are looking at sort of waste-related using waste-related fuels to create initially get the ball rolling on the sustainable aviation fuels. So that's a big part of the process. But I think to scale it up and to meet the demand at the scale that we expect by 2050, then we have to look at other sustainable sources of these biofuels. And as you say, South Africa is obviously quite well endowed in this sort of bioresource space. So I think, once we have the frameworks in place, then it's all to play for in terms of whether you use the brown infrastructure or you use you come up with new facilities, production facilities to meet that demand. So I think, it's all in the mix, but we need to get the ball rolling at some point and start scaling up, producing and scaling up sustainable aviation fuels.
And let me add, so Alan Hayward from BP, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the question. The obvious thing for me to say is ditto. Very much, you won't be surprised. What we're thinking will coincide with Shell and other participants on the panel. If I just sort of step back, I think we would say biofuels are a significant part of the current solution. Biofuels are already there, as Shell have said, particularly in countries like the US or Brazil. There's biogasoline, bioethanol. That's an important constituent part. Elsewhere in the world, it tends to be a bit more biodiesel. And the question is, where do those feedstocks come from? And I think the important thing is that we understand that those feedstocks have also got to be renewable and sustainable. And there's an evolution in the market of feedstocks. And I think it's very important, and I would absolutely advocate for, we must ensure that those feedstocks are certifiable, verifiable, and increasingly of a sustainable nature, and actually do good in the countries where we operate. Whereas there have been occasions in the past where they've not been good, or they've been detrimental to foodstuffs or detrimental to forest or animal life. So I think moving forward, and that takes you into the waste products, as was said, and whether that's vegetable oils or tallow, or increasingly, I think, biomass and municipal solid waste. Those technologies are being delivered. And one of the original questions was, are people investing? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, each of the companies that we're talking here, I think, are investing, probably an increasing amount. The technology costs have got to come down to make these things viable. They do need policy support, which tends to mean which countries in which it will first exist. And we can use existing infrastructure, as has been said. So with our refineries, we can co-process certain HVO materials. We can add hydrotreating and hydrocracking to those refineries. They do tend to sort of have a higher yield in biodiesel. And I think that is one of the pushes that everybody is trying to sort of increase the cut, which could go into the aviation fuels markets, because that's clearly where a lot of the demand is. But it's also where the substitution from a liquid fuel is probably that bit harder, and people have talked about, other fuels going into the transport mix. In aviation, certainly for the short term, I think it does look like a liquid fuel, and therefore biojet, I think, is important here for I.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much for those responses, Alan. And I think what I do get from this is, the industry does have a roadmap going forward. particularly in terms of the sustainability of the feedstocks and the types of feedstocks. And in terms of investment and just coming together to move this forward. So I'm really excited to see and to move forwards towards real net zero. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to pass back to Kaya.
Thanks so much, everyone. Our next speaker is my colleague at the Environmental Change Institute. Eli Mitchell-Larsen is an expert in decarbonization of fossil fuels. So I think this builds on perfectly. Eli, take it away.
Thanks, Kaya. Thanks, everybody. I'm Eli Mitchell-Larsen from the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. And I'd love to start a discussion with Malika Ishwaran, Senior Economist and Policy Advisor from Shell, and Alan Haywood, Head of Group Strategy from BP, about what it really means for an oil and gas major to go net zero, because I think that can be almost a counterintuitive concept for some people, and specifically the role of storing carbon in combating climate change. So BP and Shell are unique in the sense that you're among the first and really only oil and gas majors to include the carbon contained in your products in your net zero plan. So for Shell, that's a 65% reduction in carbon intensity of its products by 2050. For BP, that's net zero on carbon in BP's oil and gas production by 2050 or sooner. So this is a huge and welcome shift from only focusing on operational emissions of extraction to actually talking about the carbon content of the products. That's what happens when the consumer ultimately burns the fuel. Because of course, that's 85% of the life cycle emissions. So if we can't address that, we can't stop climate change. It's not just the emissions associated with digging up the fuels. So if that's the goal, and it's really exciting that that is the goal for companies like Shell and BP and your leaders in that sense, there's really only two ways to accomplish that goal. The first would be reducing oil and gas production. And that's something I know BP has hinted it will do by 2030. And that happens by selling fossil fuel assets to other fossil fuel companies primarily. The second way to achieve those goals would be to store an amount of CO2 that's equal to the amount of CO2 that's contained in the fuels that you sell. So there you're achieving a balance of sources and sinks. And option one, of course, selling assets to another fossil fuel company, doesn't actually stop climate change. It just passes on the responsibility. So you might be surprised to hear from a young person from the youth voice, especially in light of the divestment movement, that if the fossil fuels reserves are going to be owned, operated, and produced by someone, I'd actually rather it be you, the publicly traded companies with net zero plans, than someone else. So my first question is, briefly, could you share how you're thinking about balancing these two approaches to achieve net zero on the carbon contained in your products? So selling off the assets to other oil and gas companies, or transforming your product into a safe one that's sort of virtually decarbonized by storing enough carbon to balance what it will emit. And as a preview, we're going to come back in a moment to how we store the carbon. So we'll talk about that next. But first, the balance.
Yes, so thanks for that, Eli. And yes, so we announced in April this year, in fact, that our ambition is to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050, if not sooner. So that's very much how we're thinking about our business plans and strategies that need to evolve. I think the one thing that I would add to the mix of the two things you mentioned is the role of policy in this. There are countries like the EU and the UK that have limited and put targets in on the amount of, emissions that they think is tolerable. And that's going to sort of drive down the demand for more carbon intensive fuels. So I think for us, that's a natural, that's a change that will happen. And we've done analysis around what would a Paris compliant pathway for the world look like in terms of the changes in the energy system, in terms of the fuels that go into it, the technologies that you need. And one of the things is that we do think there is a role for oil and gas in the transition. So it's not tomorrow that you can turn it off. So there is that role. And for us, it's very much about focusing in on the assets that we think in the upstream assets that meet that demand, so that declining demand that we very much expect. And so that's part of the solution. So in terms of our portfolio and how it evolves over time, there is the whole story around the new fuels that come in that are compliant with the trajectories that policy has set in terms of reducing emissions. So there's a whole slew of fuels and technologies that you'd want to go into, like hydrogen or biofuels, which is also going to be very much part of our frame in terms of what the portfolio looks like. And then you have the emissions removals bit of it that you mentioned. And again, our analysis pathways show there's a sort of really important role for carbon capture and other sort of emissions removal technologies to pick up the residual emissions that are really difficult to get rid of from the system. So again, I think, for us, we see this as a balance and a process of evolving our strategy and business plan to meet the, to meet the demand and our own ambition to reduce our emissions over time. And some of that will involve, working our upstream assets, current upstream assets. Some of that will involve using gas as a transition fuel in countries where coal is still dominant. And some of that will involve, producing the new fuels that you can start sort of deploying in the sort of front leading countries like the EU and the UK. And then, of course, there's the whole slew of removal technologies. So again, don't see a conflict. I think that the challenge is how do you sort of activate all these sort of levers in order for the world to be compliant with the Paris Agreement and for us to meet our ambition.
Yeah, and for us, Eli, thank you for the question. It's right, Melika, what she says, that it's a combination of all of these things. Now, we've set out our ambitions and specifically around carbon, categorized it in 3 different buckets. I mean, the first is around our operational emissions, and there are interventions that we are making and will make around introducing more electrification of some of the energy sources in our actual operations, to be very thoughtful about flaring, to cut down on sort of methane leakage, these sorts of interventions where we can manage the emissions associated with our own operations. Our second aim, which is really where fundamentally our net zero, exactly as you said, Eli, comes from, is that we're saying the carbon associated with our oil and gas production, we will by 2050 ensure that's net zero or sooner. And we'll do that in a combination of ways. One of the ways you say is, in some cases, we won't be the producer any longer. And you rightly pointed out that we've said we would anticipate that we'll produce perhaps 40% less oil and gas come 2030 relative to now. Now, part of that is because we want to put the proceeds from those sales, and also by not investing in that oil and gas, we can direct proceeds into the new energies. And that's very important in our transition. We're changing the balance within BP from being very much an oil and gas producer to being a more balanced energy company. We talk about from international oil company to integrated energy company. So it's balance, and we take some of those proceeds and we take some of the cash generated from the continuing oil and gas production, and we're putting that into the transition. So some of this is about how we fund that transition. And then the third dimension of our aims is in the products which we sell, the total market materials that we sell. And there we use a measure like carbon intensity, because I think, like Shell, we're saying we will sell an increasing amount of non-carbon product. There will be an increasing amount of electricity in our portfolio for electric vehicles. There'll be an increasing amount of biofuels, as we've just been talking about. We would like to generate more renewable power in our portfolio. We'll do more hydrogen as that grows. So it's a question of what we produce, the direct emissions from that production, but also in changing the marketing portfolio, actually very much in line with the market, because ultimately the customer is demanding a different product, and we want to be part of that new energy mix.
Thanks, Alan and Malika. So I want to hone in on that idea of what this net zero state looks like, because of course, to your point, Alan, about BP's second aim, in 2050, any residual oil and gas that you're still producing unequivocally has to be balanced with commensurate carbon storage. If that's not happening, we aren't at net zero, right?
Correct.
And so I really want to hone on this idea of how do we store that carbon?
So I think,
yeah,
sorry, excitement to come through. So
yeah.
I think it is a question of, firstly, gas. So we see gas as an important fuel, and again, if I can keep picking up on something Malika said, oil and gas, we do see having a role in the energy transition for decades to come, but we see that role being increasingly decarbonized. And gas obviously has to go through a decarbonization process, and I think that needs to be accompanied by carbon capture, use, and sequestration. And in fact, I think there's been announcements recently about how we'll partner with people in Humberside, how we will use one of the depleted oil fields, gas fields, to store CO2. So we'll take the CO2 out of the gas mix. So that's particularly in sectors. And so we'll look to build, we call it net zero Teesside. We'll look to build industrial parks where particularly some of these hard to abate sectors, high temperature industries, they're going to need a decarbonized gas product or a hydrogen. We take out the CO2, we store it underground. Now, I think that storage, there are challenges on that. That has to be really robust. But I think creating a permanent solution to the removal of CO2 is important. And so CCUS, I would say that's a part of it. Hydrogen as a theme, the so-called blue hydrogen, and there's a role for the green hydrogen as well, but the blue hydrogen, that is a way of still conferring, as it were, the benefits of natural gas, but in a decarbonized form. So we'll sort of keep that going. And then I think that the last dimension is, what is the role of offsets? And again, I think we need to be, well, we have quite categorically said that our initial plans do not rely on offsets. I mean, in other words, we want to cut our own emissions and get into these decarbonization products, not rely on offsets. Now, there will be offsets in the market. We'll work with our customers, and there has to be a partnership with customers, and offsets have a role to play in that. And I think longer term, one could see offsets playing a role. But almost as I was saying around biofuels, about how these have to be, frankly, beyond reproach, how things have to be, of the highest standard and verifiable. I think offsets have a role to play. So, you start to see these reduction technologies, and offsets and the sequestration, I think all comes together. Now, they all need some help. They need alignment with policy. They need to happen where scale can happen. And I think very interestingly, a lot of these things are happening in partnerships. That would be one theme I would have for today, Eli. A lot of this stuff needs to be worked in combination with governments and consumers and producers and all the very interested stakeholders. And that includes academia. I think academia has an important role to play in helping us to understand. And I would say we need help. I mean, we need help to understand what the possible.
Thanks, Alan. That's excellent. And I know we have to move on really shortly to our next youth speaker, Simonetta, but just briefly, if I could jump in before, because I'd love to hear from Malika. I think what I'm sort of getting at is this idea of packaging carbon storage with a product that's decarbonized. And Shell is already doing this a bit. I think at the pump, you can basically pay a little bit of extra. And what that really means is, some trees have been planted maybe in Southeast Asia or something that will capture the carbon that goes into that would come out from the emissions from the fuel. But I just wanted to sort of draw attention to, I think, the youth voice that is quite skeptical of that in a lot of ways. And really, there's no reason why we can't pursue ecosystem restoration and protections against biodiversity, all the amazing things that nature-based solutions provide on their own merits, right? Without generating carbon credits, because I think there's a lot of risk in terms of, can we really use nature-based solutions to store carbon in perpetuity, which is what we're really doing, right? If we take carbon out of the geosphere where it was stored forever and then we release it, presumably the way that we store carbon to balance that should be equally permanent. And so I just wanted to say that I think from the youth perspective, for these net zero goals on the embedded carbon to be credible, the world really needs to be certain that for each ton of CO2 that Shell or BP takes out of the ground in the form of gas or oil, another ton of CO2 is stored in a way that's transparently accounted for. It's safe from being re-released in perpetuity. So I'd just love to hear from Malika a little bit on that, because I know Shell has been very active in promoting nature-based solutions and effectively converting fossil carbon into trees. Would love to hear about that.
Yes, so I think, yeah, you're right. We have the voluntary sort of, approach of sort of selling the offsets alongside some of our products. But I think, that's one avenue that comes out in our thinking and other people's thinking in terms of how do you get to net zero by 2050. I mean, CCS, is carbon capture and storage, is absolutely sort of a fundamental technology. I mean, that said, our approach is to, if you can avoid emissions, then do so. If you can reduce them, then do so. And then if you can't go beyond that, that's when the capture and storage element comes in. So I think it's absolutely fundamental. And I think one of the things that always strikes me is that carbon capture and storage is a technology that doesn't inherently have a value unless you put a value on emissions. So you need that carbon price to be able to make carbon capture sort of viable, if you like. And then also we sort of the realization that carbon price is sort of ramping up relatively slowly. And so if you want to get projects off the ground today, that's not going to be enough to sort of make it commercial. So you have to start thinking around, what are the other mechanisms that you need to support this technology, and a whole bunch of levers that you could have around, supporting the infrastructure, or supporting, the long-term liabilities, all sorts of other mechanisms. And what's interesting is in our projects on CCS across the world, because we have a whole number of them, it's a different combination of levers depending on what the policy environment in that particular country is or region, that you can then stack together to make a case for investment. So what we do and what makes it viable in the US, in Canada, where we have a Quest program, which captures, is different from what makes it viable, say, in Northern Lights, which is in the North Sea in Norway. So again, I think, to me, it's absolutely crucial technology. I would not disagree. But the question is, there are different ways, and how do you incentivize it to come into to be something commercially investable? And I think that's where sort of the story around the policy environment that helps you get there becomes quite crucial.
Thank you so much for those thoughtful responses. And of course, you mentioned a carbon price. Many companies who have set a net zero target are bringing in a carbon price into their own companies. So they're sort of making it for themselves, even if the laws haven't kept up. I think we're leapfrogging a bit. Thank you so much to everyone who has just joined us. We had a little bit of a power outage at the Said Business School, and so the live stream was not working on the website. Now we have a party on Zoom. So welcome to the almost 100 participants who have just joined us, and we're so glad you're here. Our next speaker promises to bring more difficult, wonderful, rich questions, because that's what she does for a job. Simonetta Spavieri is a responsible investment analyst and a Venezuelan activist, and also a friend, and I'm so happy to bring you on. Simonetta, take the stage.
Thank you, Kaya, and thank you, Eli and Farai previously. I'm sad to hear that not everyone was listening to that amazing exchange that was taking place. I'm sure it's all recorded and you can hear it later. But as the event is called Youth Sets the Agenda, I wanted to make sure that you business executives and leaders take back from us a clear steer of what we think the agenda for the sector should be, and what we are, like, as youth, are expecting from you. We're expecting 3 things, and they sound very simple, but they're very hard, and I know. Make net zero happen is the first. Second is bring the system with you to net zero. And the third is act now, which is stolen from Greta, as you know. But first, I wanted to share a bit of why I'm here with you today. As Kaya said, I work as responsible investment analyst, and part of my role on my day-to-day is to shape investor expectations on climate change. But my own understanding of what expectations entail comes from my experience in Venezuela, living under the dictatorial regime and the economic collapse of Venezuela. And in Venezuela, expectations meant hope for a better future. And every now and then they sparked protests. And I learned that expectations and hope were dictators' worst enemies. But sadly, I also learned that expectations may never materialize, and that decline can be continuous, and that the rock doesn't hit the bottom. So this thought of continuous decline keeps me awake at night, makes me work every day with passion as a responsible investor, scrutinizing your climate targets, because I cannot believe that we may be in the situation in which all this effort and Nigel's and the race to zero and your ambitions don't bring about the change, the transformative change that is required, and that the planet follows the decline I've seen happen in Venezuela. And because we can't allow that to happen, youth are stepping up, and we're taking the responsibility, and we want you to help us to achieve these 3 objectives I set early make net zero emissions happen. And Eli has already more or less defined what we mean by net zero. It means the emissions from your operations, but also from the sale of your products, and leaving only net for the permanent removal of residual emissions. And by make it happen, I mean bring into commercial scale the technologies needed and decarbonizing your business models. The second thing, bring the system with you to net zero, is by working with others and not in silos, advocating for policy that enables a faster transition, not just stop lobbying, and bring with you your supply chain, the members of your industry, the workers, the communities, making sure it's also a just transition. And the third and most important, and it doesn't matter if anything else happens, is act now by aligning your strategies, your capital investment, the internal governance and management incentives to what is required for your company to achieve net zero. And act now, not stopping business as usual, but demonstrating leadership. Act now so we as the youth can again build trust on you, and also so the expectations don't happen to be just dreams, as in my experience in Venezuela. So we collectively as a group here, Farai, Eli, all pitched in, and Kaya and Diana, thought of some actions that we would like you to have happening now. And they are for us like the simple building blocks of trust to see, well, this is what we want to see. Eva, we would like to know, when is Daimler ending the manufacturing of the internal combustion engine globally? And Alan and Malika, when can BP and Shell tell us that you're stopping all exploration activity? And Otto and Jonathan, you're more in sort of providing a service, so it's kind of tricky, but can your companies commit to placing a cap on offsets to ensure these are used only to address the residual emissions we've been discussing? And I'm keen to hear, I don't know how, Kaya, you want them to respond to this.
Eva, will you start?
All right, I'm happy to start, and thanks for your emotional introduction. I can fully understand it. I'm an engineer, so maybe I answer more like, as an engineer, we have the ambition 2039 for Daimler, and that's a very important step because we promise we'll be CO2 neutral by 2039, and that's 10 years before we would have to be. So we also joined the Climate Pledge Initiative, for example. That's one important thing. And then I agree with you, we have to have a specific plan. How do we get there? And we do. By really now, we're in the midst of launching a lot of battery electric vehicles, additional to the plug-in vehicles, and bringing the whole supply chain to also becoming CO2 neutral, but also bringing the customer to getting used to driving electric. Because then in 2030, we want to have more than 50% of battery electric or plug-in vehicles. And we have to have the infrastructure follow, because otherwise it's not pragmatic and people won't buy it. So we have to bring the whole system there, and also we have to make it a sustainable business. It's also something I want to point out here. We have a strategy of modern sustainable luxury, and I think it fits very well because we believe that luxury as of now and as of in the future has to be also responsible. You cannot sell a car for a lot of money and then be like a CO2 sinner. It doesn't work.
Thank you so much, Eva, for that incredible response. I think I heard you right. Would you just repeat what your commitment is by 2039?
We'll be CO2 neutral.
And will you phase out of the manufacturing of combustion engine vehicles?
We'll phase out in stages, but I cannot give you the exact date.
Okay. Thank you.
When you say in stages, the question was also intending to be globally. I understand you're prioritizing certain markets because the reality that you've all been discussing, like policy comes first when it comes first. But it's also in the plans to phase it out globally, is it?
It is a global strategy. Also, the CO2 neutral mission is globally 2039. Yeah.
Great. Simonetta, would you repeat your next question?
Sure. No, it was Alan and Malika, can BP and Shell tell us when you're stopping all exploration activity?
So I'm happy to dive into this one, and actually there are a number of themes that you put in, Simonetta, and I, they do resonate. I mean, I think you have to say, I want to say, they resonate, and partly they resonate. Look, I have a 13-year-old son, and for 3 weeks running, every single day, he basically said to me, "Dad, what have you done for the energy transition today?" And that was before I came into the strategy team. And actually, it was interesting because I was able to say, well, funny you mention it, but we did today approve an animal manure digester which will produce biogas in the US. We did today, get into a forestry project. We did today, so I think the important thing is things are happening. Now, whether it's enough and fast enough, I think that's a very fair question, but things are happening. And I think, there is genuine commitment. But I also think the point you make about trust is right. So there are people like you who are asking, can we trust you? You may be saying the right things, BP, are you going to deliver? But actually the investors are saying the same thing. They're saying we want proof of the pudding. You've laid out a strategy. We want to see you deliver. So what we've tried to do is to lay out some very clear targets and metrics. And we know that you and the market and ourselves, because trust me, our employees are really keen on this. Our employees have also pushed us into this. And if we're going to hire people in the future, they want to come to a company which they think is a force for good and is tackling these complex problems in partnership with everybody else. So we lay out those metrics, and we know that if we don't deliver them, the trust goes. So we have to constantly deliver them. Now, your very specific question was, can I tell you when we're going to stop exploration? No. What I can tell you is that we were clear that we will not explore in new provinces, in new countries. What I can tell you is that in 2010, we had a budget of, I think, $4.6 billion for exploration. Last year, that was $800 million. And I think over time, it will get less. So remember, we do see a role for hydrocarbons. We do see the ability to find more in areas where we already are. So that will be cheaper. And partly one of the points about cheaper is therefore better able to withstand, the energy transition, i.e. afford what it takes to decarbonize. But I think, I can't give you the exact answer you're looking for, and I won't make a promise so that we can't keep, but exploration is less important than it used to be, and new provinces are out of the question for us.
If I can come in. So again, it is a complex, as you probably know, complex, changing your current portfolio towards the future. But I love your call for action and the 3 points you brought up there. And I think, that's part of the reason I joined Shell, is to sort of play an active and, sort of a part in the energy transition. So I think, they put in net zero, yes, of course. And that's part of the first step when we announced we want to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. That set the frame for us in terms of what kind of portfolio changes do you need to make to get there. So that's the first step. The next step is to think about what you said, system change. Because a lot of times when in our previous incarnation, oil and gas, you you draw the boundary around yourself in terms of the products you sell. So you don't think about the demand side, where a lot of these products need to be taken up. So we could produce a lot of green hydrogen, but if it's more expensive and there's no demand, you sort of stymied. You just have a lot of supply that doesn't, has nowhere to go. So we very much believe that, you have to take system-wide leadership to drive and create the markets that then, these products will supply into, and then also to support and work with governments around infrastructure. What do you need? How do you scale it up? Because frankly, 30 years is not a long time to change the energy system so fundamentally. And so that, which brings me to your third point, which is act now. And that's exactly the intention, is to get the ball rolling, maybe focusing on some geographies which are more sort of policy advanced, if you like. So it sort of helps to do it. But what we're hoping is that then has a demonstration effect, that it can be done. And then you can sort of create more confidence in the other geographies. You can create more confidence among customers that this is something that's viable. So I think completely agree that, the act now bit is absolutely essential, because really 30 years to really essentially rewire the global economy is not a long time.
Thank you, Malika, but I don't want to let you go off without saying the question on if you're going to stop all exploration activity that Alan had a chance to respond.
Yeah, so again, I would say the same answer, right? It's a complex decision that you're making about within your portfolio. So, it is declining. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We don't see oil and gas demand sort of staying at the levels it is today and declining quite substantially. So we look across our portfolio and see which are the ones we'll focus on the core upstream assets that we can use to meet that demand in the transition. But clearly the end goal is to have a net zero sort of global economy. And we play within that. So it's a complicated, we'll phase out. There's no doubt that we will be phasing out our sort of exploration activities, the amount we spend on it. And so, but again, it's hard to sort of put a date on record saying by this date.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Shall I repeat for Otto and Jonathan? Because that was a bit of a strange one.
Yeah, I've got a question. I can happy
you've
to
got
dive
it.
in there. Yeah, so it's about offsets, when we can put
Thank
a cap
you.
on offsets.
Yeah.
No, well, thank you for your question, Simonetta. And it is a key one for us as an industry. I mean, up front, I'd say that we would prefer not to have to rely on offsets. We would much rather be able to reduce our own in-sector emissions, but it's just a fact of the physics of flying that we will be relying on liquid fuels for the next 10 to 15 years, as there are very limited, as you know, technology alternatives. But that said, they are for us the last resort. As an industry, we have a 4-pillar strategy. So our priorities are to improve our operational efficiencies, introduce new aircraft and engine technology, including hybrid electric and hydrogen, and then sustainable aviation fuels, which are critical, and we focus a lot on because they are available now. So they're an immediate solution. And then after all of those options have been exhausted, we then rely on carbon offsets. But I will say that we recognize that there are good carbon offsets and there are poor carbon offsets. And as an industry, our reputation is totally dependent on only using the highest quality, fully sustainable offsets. And so for us as an industry, they are managed through ICAO, our UN special agency, through the CORSIA scheme, the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. So they've set up a very robust governance structure. It's called a Technical Advisory Board. It is that is overseen by 37 member states, and it's a very rigorous. So to qualify to be used as an offset in aviation, you have to go through quite an extensive selection process. And as I say, 36 member states are involved in that process. And you can go onto the ICAO website and talk to I encourage you to talk to the offset providers that have qualified, and they'll explain to you the very painful exercise they've had to go to. But that's very important for us. We only want to use those most sustainable offsets. And then finally, I would say, and it's very much an interim solution. We are focusing very hard to improve the level of performance of those first 3 pillars, to maximize our in-sector reductions. And eventually, we hope that greenhouse gas removal technology will replace the need for offsets in terms of any out-of-sector reductions. And and that's why I'm happy to say we're part of a coalition in the UK, Coalition for Negative Emissions, lobbying the government not only on SAF, but on greenhouse gas removal technologies to get these in sooner. Now, when can we put a cap? I would want it as soon as possible. We don't want to use offsets. We want to reduce our emissions. So the more we can do on sustainable aviation fuels, the more we can do on greenhouse gas removal technology, the quicker we will avoid having to use carbon offsets.
Thank you. Maybe Otto, do you want to also respond on capping offsets? I know that Kuhne and Nagel are even using offsets to say that you're carbon neutral next year, and I think that is interesting and important, because every CO2 that goes to the atmosphere matters, but also it's important how we use the terminology right and how we don't fool ourselves that there's so much more to be done, and that these offsets are clearly just as Jonathan was saying, just an interim target. Are you there, Otto?
Thanks for also your very emotional speech. I liked it, and I can only echo what some of my previous speakers, Malika, Jonathan, also said. we as a company, our what we consider scope 1 and 2, so the emissions we are directly responsible for in our operation. Our operation is mostly in buildings, in warehouses, etc. We already 10 years ago, we tried to reduce it as much as possible. We still have about 300,000 tons of CO2 left in our operation, which we control directly. And we are trying to buy mostly renewable energies, partially from people like Shell or BP or other energy providers. We have a goal to bring this 300,000 tons in the next 5 years down to 150 to 200,000 tons, because there are still countries in the world where you cannot buy renewable energy yet. So we decided last year, all those emissions which we still produce, we will offset. So there is indirectly a cap on it. So we are, as of this year, so all our emissions, the 300,000 tons this year, next year perhaps 250,000 tons, will be offset. And similar to what Jonathan said, we only invest into the highest gold standard products in Africa. So a lot of the UN SDGs, that's why I'm always proud to have the UN SDGs behind me, because we don't only want to invest into nature-based solutions, but also create jobs and schools and do more things than only taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. When it comes to scope 3, which is when transportation, and that's where we rely, of course, on shipping lines or airlines, and we heard it from Jonathan also. There we know realistically this will be another 10 to 20 years till we can start to decarbonize transportation really. But we set ourselves a clear goal that by 2030, all the emissions which scope 3 we are not directly responsible for, we want to offset together with our customers. So we will talk to customers, they have to pay for this, investing into these solutions. So by 2030, we want to be 100% our supply chains, which we manage to be carbon neutral, which is a lot of offsetting. And we, of course, have a lot of arguments also with younger generations. I actually had a discussion with Greta on this directly. And we said there is no solution unless we stop consuming, we stop flying, we stop moving goods around the world. Then, of course, we would not produce any more CO2. So it's an interim solution. And we have to wait till technology is there. But I'm optimistic that the oil companies, the airlines, the shipping lines, the shipyards, they are working on this, and it's coming.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. It strikes me that you all gave a lot of support to what we're saying, which shows our thinking is really aligned. I think people don't always realize that kind of the youth climate leaders and industry leaders have really aligned thinking. Where I think we could improve on is setting real target dates and real metrics for, what percentage of offsets will be permanent storage and by when? When will we expect to? Of course, that's difficult, especially given that you're in a market with shareholders. But it would also signal to the market a huge shift in the direction of change. And so we just thank you so much for the work you're doing to get those commitments out. I know you're all making blueprints that will probably, some of them come out in the first quarter next year. We'll be cheering you on to make those ambitious. And here to have the last word in this session, Diana Njeru, who's an incredible world-class journalist, is used to asking good questions just as we have today, but I also want you to listen to the stories that she's bringing and representing in this last piece of the session. So Diana, who represents BBC Media Action usually, and Resilient 40, one of our partners, please would you take the stage now?
Thanks, Kaya. Hi, everybody. The discussions have been very interesting and entertaining. So I would like to give you a perspective maybe from Africa. As Kaya mentioned, I work for BBC Media Action, which is the development arm of the BBC here in Kenya, but I'm also a member of the Resilient 40, which is a network of young climate and social activists that are directing the voices and work of young people on climate change across the continent of Africa. So I'm currently managing a climate change project in East Africa that's called Weatherwise. And we are training young journalists from 10 radio stations across East Africa to produce life-saving climate change radio programs for farmers, fishermen, and pastoralists who are the most affected by climate change. They are extremely poor communities. And I've had a very good opportunity to interact with the audiences that these radio stations broadcast to. And for the audiences we broadcast to, climate change is a human rights issue. It affects their health, it affects their access to clean water, to food, to adequate shelter. These communities whose adaptive capacities are quite low are already experiencing the devastating impacts of climate change today. I spoke to a young mother in northern Kenya, for example, who told me that because of the longer droughts, she now has to walk for 13 hours to fetch water for her family. And this water is more often than not contaminated. She can't afford any form of transportation, and she's in fact had to pull her daughters out of school so that they can carry as much water back as possible. So it's, it's affecting the upcoming generation as well. And because she will probably never have an opportunity to speak to in a forum like this, I feel that it's my responsibility to represent her. So despite the fact that Africa contributes to only 3.6% of global emissions, temperatures in Africa are rising higher than the global average, especially in arid areas like in northern Kenya, where I mentioned the young mother. Projections show that most parts of Africa will reach the 1.5 degree limit by 2023. That's just 3 years from now. And that by 2030, most parts of Africa will be 2 degrees warmer. Some parts of the region are already experiencing temperature increases of 2.5 degrees. Extreme weather events are also increasing in Africa. We have longer and more severe droughts, heavy rainfall, floods and cyclones, and more recently, the desert locust invasions. We hadn't had a desert locust invasion in Kenya, for example, for 70 years. And of course, you've heard of Cyclone Idai that happened last year in Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi that had devastating impacts on the poorest and most vulnerable. And we've also seen record level sea rises in some of our lakes. We've seen record level sea levels, water levels rises, sorry. It's those that are dependent on climate sensitive livelihood systems, such as the subsistence farmers that we broadcast to, fishermen and pastoralists that are hit the hardest. And our governance systems in Africa, often fail to implement policies to adapt to climate change and to mitigate its impacts. And developed nations sometimes take advantage of the fact that we have limited policies to protect our ecosystems, allowing them to exploit Africa's natural resources at the cost of people whose livelihoods and lives are already at stake, as is the case with the East African pipeline, for example, or in the Congo. In Kenya, our transport industry is growing with the construction of roads, trains, the expansion of our airlines and our shipping industries. We even have our very first car, Kenyan-made car called the Mobius. We are laying the foundations for development and are looking towards developed nations, and how developed nations grew from the Industrial Revolution as our blueprint. And of course, young people in Kenya, like many across Africa and across the world, they dream of success, owning a car, traveling by air. So as we reflect on the progress made since the Paris Agreement 5 years ago, I think it's important for us to also ask ourselves whether this progress has improved the quality of life of the most vulnerable communities in Africa, who are often the least responsible for climate change, but the most affected. And they have been marginalized for too long. We have an opportunity to leapfrog to a green economy, invest in renewable energy and take advantage of innovations that are good for Africa's climate and our economy, and improve the quality of life of poor people in Africa. So I want to leave you with this question as you race to zero. what can you do to enable Africa leapfrog to a clean and affordable transport system, as opposed to fossil fuels, as the impacts of climate change are already being felt, particularly by the most vulnerable in the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to open it up to any panelist who will respond.
Let me jump in on that one. So yes, thank you, Diana, for that. I think a lot of times when we are working in sort of countries like the UK or US, you forget what the challenges and sort of the wider issues that are become very important in other parts of the world that are potentially less developed or emerging. And I think it's a reminder that actually, if you try to tackle climate change, you can help improve a lot of these other issues. So it's not just about talking about the energy transition in a climate context, but the potential is here for improving quality of life more generally, and maybe not following the growth and development paths that the developed economies of today have done, and the opportunity to do it better. And differently. So I think I would very much echo and sort of appreciate the comments you made. I think we have a commitment to help increase energy access, focusing on Asia and Africa to clean and affordable energy. So very much in line with the UN SDGs. And that's something that we're working quite hard to drive. And again, it's not just the emissions that count against our carbon footprint, but it's about improving the quality of life more generally in areas where energy itself hasn't become fundamental to their lives. And so why not start a path towards clean energy rather than following a development path that has been shown to be lacking anyway in terms of climate. So thank you for your intervention.
Hi, Diana, and no, thank you for your speech. That's excellent. And just from an aviation point of view, and I can talk about, we are very focused in the global aviation community, working with all carriers to help them on their sustainability journeys. So through IATA, we have this mantra, no airline left behind. So, and you have some great airlines in Africa. I mean, Kenya Airlines, for example, Kenya Airways are a real example of an airline in Africa leading on the sustainability challenge. And I've mentioned South African Airlines as well. But through IATA and through ICAO, and I'm really happy to say that most of the African states have signed up to the CORSIA scheme, the Global Carbon Offsetting Reduction Scheme. So we're seeing a real commitment and drive from both the African states and to participate in aviation's journey to sustainability. And we'll certainly work as a global community to help wherever we can to accelerate that.
We'll take one or two more.
I'll come on. I think, firstly, it's not something I think I have an immediate answer to, and I think that's one of the really important things about any dialogue, that we hear the point which is made and we reflect on it. I think the second point is, certainly as a company, and I think others are similar, we have relationships with certain of the governments. We work in certain of the countries. In our case, it may be Angola, it may be Mauritania, Senegal. I think the partnership that we can bring with governments is very important. So how we ensure that our activity in country leaves a lasting legacy for the country, and how we can bring new technologies and new ideas and work together. I think this sort of sense of partnership, which is increasing, and it's particularly increasing because so many countries are committing to net zero, so many cities are committing to net zero. There's an opportunity. I mean, we've set up a team called Regions and Cities for exactly that reason, to try and work with people. And I think it is that sort of dialogue that we need to generate, particularly with host countries in developing markets. Thanks, Kaya.
Thanks. I think it's a good sign when your last used speaker leaves the panel speechless. On that note, I'd like to transition us to our really last speaker, Nigel Topping, who is our high-level champion. I want to just say that we absolutely can't afford to leave the discussion here. There were a lot of threads left untied, and I hope that everyone comes away from this conversation and probably, as you do a lot of nights, stays up thinking, what can I do as a person? Who can I influence? What other company, who can I call up? Because they're not doing enough. Because even if I feel that my company is moving in the right direction and I'm doing what I can within my company, who else can I talk to? And we'd like to help you have those conversations more. We want to extend this as a collaboration, but there's no one better to speak to that spirit of collaboration and what we do next all together than Nigel Topping. So thank you so much for Nigel for listening, and please come in now.
Wow. Really fantastic. When we decided to work with an amazing group of partners to create these 2 weeks of Race to Zero dialogues, most people think the emphasis was on the Race to Zero bit of the title. But Gonzalo Munoz and I, the Chilean high-level champion, really, really believe in the dialogue word. Most of us are trained to debate. And the etymological root of debate is the same as the word for batter. It's a conflict. It's one idea against the other. So we're trained to win a debate, to think that one person's right and the other person's wrong. And sometimes that's necessary, sometimes that's appropriate. Right? Sometimes you have to make a decision. If you're in a company trying to make a decision on a capex, the person pushing for the hydrogen investment is competing with the person pushing for the CCS investment, and so you've got to get into the debate. But when we're talking about such complex systems change issues, we have to be able to have dialogues, which is not about beating each other up, but it's about listening to each other. And in the listening comes the chance that we all might learn. Right, we might be inspired by what someone else has said. We might be challenged, but because we're not trying to win, we have a chance to be a bit more respectful and a little bit slower in coming to our conclusion. So first of all, I want to thank Shah and Kaya and Peter and the team and all the partners for creating such a respectful opportunity for us all to listen to each other. And that means we don't have to be right and we don't have to agree, right? It's actually quite nice sometimes to not have to be right or have to agree. But we all have a chance to learn. So first of all, I want to thank you for that. So second thing I think is so important is I read the history of the moonshot in I don't know, maybe it was last Christmas. It seems like a few weeks ago. It's probably a few months ago. Because that was an example where a crazy leader said, we're going to do something that everyone says is impossible. And the world responded. In fact, engineers responded, right? Let's face it. I mean, engineers, I think, love a challenge that people say is impossible. It's kind of what they live for. And if you read the detailed story, when the Eagle landed on the moon, which 8 years before people thought was impossible because they didn't know what the surface of the moon was. They thought there might be 60 foot of space dust and that the Eagle might drown. They didn't have space suits. The best mathematicians in MIT said we can't even calculate an orbital trajectory. So even if you could build the vehicle to get there, we don't know how to steer it. Of course, we didn't have the computing power in '61. All those problems have been solved. But when the actual Eagle landed, two of the people making key decisions, two young engineers, one at MIT and one in NASA, had both been teenagers when Kennedy said we're going to land on the moon. So I think for me, one of the most exciting things is to not just think of young people as frightened or angry or overwhelmed teenagers, but also as part of solving the problem. And I think that the depth of understanding and the clarity of the questions really shows that all of this is not asymmetrical in the sense of we don't know what we're doing, you have to solve the problem. This conversation is about finding the solution together, and I think that's so important. In fact, I actually don't really like the framing of my generation's fucked it up, the next generation is going to solve it, or my generation's fucked it up, we have to solve it quickly before we die for the next generation. Actually, I think if you're 20 and I'm 54, even 64. Basically, in geological terms, we're the same generation, and our job is to fix this together for the generations unborn. And I prefer to think of us working together and bringing that kind of mix of, I think the chief engineer in the Apollo missions was 54, which happens to be the age I am now. I think that's a pretty good age. You're pretty wise and smart, right? But in his team, he had really young engineers who were the ones who had to make a split-second decision about whether or not to abort the landing when the computer cut out just before the point of no return. So I think a mix of youth and experience in problem-solving teams we know is good. If you have only 20-year-olds or only 60-year-olds, it's going to be a weaker team, as with all sorts of diversity. So I really thank you for bringing that spirit of respectful dialogue. I think we're really hearing the story of systems transformation here over and over again. It takes action on the supply side. If you're a fuel manufacturer, on the demand side, if you're an airline, or if you're Kuehne and Nagel, actually operating that whole kind of value chain. And it takes change from those actors and from policymakers and from investors and from other actors like cities. I just like to remind ourselves, I think sometimes we're not, I think sometimes we don't back ourselves enough in our ability to innovate. And I think that's definitely something which, the longer you've been in one industry, the more likely you are to fall into that trap, right? Because you kind of know all the reasons why you can't do things. It's part of managing risk, right? You actually have to know that. If you're literally responsible for keeping the lights on as an electric utility, you kind of have to know all the things that can go wrong, because your job is to prevent those. So people coming up and telling you to change everything and that you can do everything really fast is quite challenging. But I do think gradually we are learning to back ourselves more. Some of you heard me say this before, but if you take the transition to electric vehicles, which, by the way, BP and Shell have had a public policy position to tell the UK government that date should be 2030, right? So that's no one would have believed that. I think even 3 years ago, everybody, right? So that's a symptom of just how much we're all grappling with the complexity of this change, and I really applaud BP and Shell for taking that position. I hope the UK government's going to listen to that, and in the next few days we'll hear their decision on that. But just this, we nearly always solve problems faster than we thought we could, but it goes really slow at first, which is really frustrating. So this is the S curve, right? But just to remind you of the trajectory. We are now in a situation where the UK is probably going to say 2030, Biden is probably going to say 2035. Newsom in California has already said at 2035 for light and heavy vehicles. China's almost certainly going to say 2035 in the 14th five-year plan. Basically, the combustion engine is dead in the next 10 to 15 years. Daimler said 2039. I think it'll come. I've had this conversation with Ola, the CEO of Daimler. I think it'll happen sooner, because I think you will get there faster because your engineers are amazing, and there's a lot of amazing engineers in the world. Tesla kind of in 2016, a few months after Paris, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was saying, world, you're still going to be building combustion engine cars in the 2070s. How wrong they were. Tesla starts disrupting. London starts exploring. France and the UK say 2040. Mercedes say 2039. I think laying down the gauntlet for all the other vehicle manufacturers to match that. BP and Shell, as I say, now advocating for much earlier phase-out dates, because, as Ben van Beurden said, it gives clarity. You don't have to guess when it's going to happen. And now I think we'll have, as my studio light goes out because I didn't charge the battery, it's going to happen in 2030, 2035, 40 years earlier than we thought 4 years ago. Bloomberg Green and Bloomberg New Energy Finance are some of the best thinkers about these transitions, wrote an article recently saying, we keep getting it wrong. 5 years ago, we thought coal would peak in 2040. Now we think it peaked 2 years ago. So the future keeps coming at us decades earlier than we thought, which is why I think, and we're publishing with the Marrakesh Partnership, with all the partners we're working on, a whole series of pathways, working with many partners, and many of these collaborations like Clean Skies for Tomorrow and like the Getting to Zero Coalition. And we're going to be publishing S-curves, which we think are more accurate than the ones that are steering governments and investors right now, because the ones from the IEA and Bloomberg are always wrong. They keep correcting them every single year. At some point, you've got to say, if you correct every year, your fundamental assumption is wrong. I'll give you my favorite example. Bloomberg published a curve which shows the historic cost reduction in batteries. It's 20% compound the last 10 years. Every year. That's because it's a massive market and there's a lot of smart engineers and chemists working on it, right? 20% a year last 10 years. Then they project forward 10% a year. So that's my humanities ingenuity halves today exhibit A for our inability to back our ability to innovate. And so I'm really confident that actually as we come together as in systems and we start aligning around, let's take sustainable aviation fuel. At the moment, it's 0.01% of the mix, but there's a gradual convergence around the idea that it should be 2% by 2025. Right, that's a 200x. It's like a 20,000% increase. That's a massive increase, right? And we think that can go to 10% 2025, 90% 2040. It can be 100%. And of course, there's other things happening with electrification of short distance flight. So I think it's really important that we learn the lesson of this kind of dialogue around systems change, that we start converging on the concrete next steps. I love the specificity of the questions about what are you doing now, not just what you're doing in 10, 20 years. And everyone's got answers, right? Everyone's in action on the table here. And I believe that this COP in Paris could be the moment when we actually back ourselves as a civilization, as a species, to get ourselves out of the shit that we've got ourselves into, because it's serious, right? That's why the urgency and Diana, thank you for bringing it back to the human experience in the communities you're working with today. This is really serious. When the IPCC publish the next generation of their reports next year, they're going to tell us again that it's more serious, that the impacts are worse than they thought last time. So that the sense of urgency is real. That's why it is a race. But I'm confident we can get to COP26 and sector after sector, we can say, actually, we know the trajectory, not exactly what we're going to do in 20, 30 years time, but we've got a good enough idea to back that trajectory. And we've got enough people committed to the next 5 to 10 years to say, this sector is on its way to net zero. This sector is on its way to net zero. This sector is on its way to net zero. And the final point I want to make is, Diana, I really hear your point about the need to address the vulnerable. And when we talk about adaptation and resilience as a phrase, which seems to be something that is being negotiated, we often forget that it's a human vulnerability, that it's its heart. So Gonzalo and I are working with a lot of partners on a, I feel like, a sister campaign to the Race to Zero, which we might call the Race for Resilience, unless anyone's got a better name, but which will really be focused on how do we address the fragility of human lives in an urban situation, in particularly in informal settlements, who are the most vulnerable to climate risk, in cities and in rural communities, particularly smallholder farmers, as you call it out, who are the most vulnerable in rural communities. So we hope that by the time we get to COP26, we have not as much momentum as we have on the mitigation campaigns, because these are much more mature and this is a very sophisticated dialogue that illustrates it. But we hope we're starting to have much more momentum on resilience as well. So Kaya, thank you for convening a wonderful dialogue. I've learned a lot, and I'm really encouraged by the kind of respect and the learning and the challenge, which is welcome, right? Keep challenging, keep asking hard questions. We have to keep asking hard questions of each other and of ourselves, and only like that can we go from dialogue to action at enough scale to de-risk it for us all, so that we can go faster and faster and faster and get where we need to get to as soon as possible. Thank you, Kaya.
Thank you all so much for your time tonight. And our last question for you is if you will just continue being in dialogue with us. It's been so valuable to have you here. And thank you for your time, everyone.